And now we're on to the Fireside poets. And the Fireside poets are the American poetic romantics. So they have in common with the romantics most of the things that the romantics believe in. They believe that the world's basically about good and evil, that everybody is unique, that everybody has a built-in moral compass that they need to follow, your heart, your emotions. Emotions are the center of everything. They accept all of those things, same as other romantics. They're different, however, from, say, the European romantics in a number of ways. The European romantics are much more interested in the individual than they are in good and evil. And the Fireside poets are much more interested in good and evil. The European romantics are much more concerned with politics. To them, the central issue is the state versus the individual. And, of course, the state coerces the individual out of being an individual at every possible opportunity. Probably the American philosophic romantics, the transcendentalists, have more in common in that respect with the European romantics. Fireside romantics are not very political. They sometimes deal with patriotism as a topic, but they don't deal with politics. The European romantic poets spurred a number of unsuccessful revolutions in the middle 1800s. The Fireside poets never stirred anybody up to revolution. The Fireside poets have a much more traditional sense of morality than the European romantics have. The European romantics really seem to take that idea that you are a law unto yourself, that you are a unique form of the good, and that you have to live that out, than the Fireside poets did. Probably the best example of that would be the difference between Whittier and Lord Byron. Almost all of the group that hung out with Byron and Keats and Shelley, all of them are major league drug users, alcoholics, orgies for the summer. It's almost like Byron's wife divorces him because he won't stop sleeping with his sister. I don't make this stuff up. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote, what did Harriet Beecher Stowe write? Uncle Tom's Cabin. Also wrote a whole book on Byron and the breakup of that marriage and his relationship with his sister. Of course, Byron said she's only my half-sister, so it doesn't really count. The European romantics' behavior was almost like they stayed up at night saying, what bizarre thing can I do tomorrow to prove that I'm living by my own morality and not by traditional morality? Because if you're going to be yourself, you have to reject the past. You have to reject tradition. You have to reject the law. You have to reject custom. You have to follow your heart. Your heart will tell you what's good. Thank you. And your good probably isn't what was good before, because you're unique. There's never been a you before. There are no rules for being you. The only rule is follow your heart, and that's what you have to do. So the European romantics acted on that, and in terms of to the Fireside's way of looking at things, these people were really acting out. The Fireside poets accepted, the idea of true love. Anybody know what true love is about? Well, first of all, it extends beyond the grave. It stems from the idea that you have a soulmate, the other half of your soul. And that when you meet them, you'll know them. Your eyes will meet, and you'll know that's them. And everybody's got this soulmate. And your love isn't just of this world. It extends beyond this world. The American romantics believed that when you died, eventually, they were almost uniformly Christian and Protestant for that matter. They believed the end of the world, everybody rises up out of the grave, and true lovers are reunited. You'll be reunited with the other half of your soul. Whittier met his true love when he was in high school. but he was a Quaker, and her father hated Quakers, and so there was no way that they could even go out on a date or he could court her because he'd never get her father's permission. He left town right after graduation, but the day before he left, they got together and they spent the day together. If you meet your true love, what do you do about it? Jump into bed immediately? I mean, that's what you do now, right? I mean, that's the rumor. I don't know. I'm so old, and I can't even quite remember how things were even in the early 60s. But what do? First of all, they wait. They're real big on anticipation. What would happen? What are the odds on you actually finding and marrying your true love in a society where your father has an awful lot to say about who you marry? Not real good, especially when even you yourself are looking around for a good provider, as is every other woman. You're going to be judged as a woman on the basis of the marriage that you make and how successful that becomes. So the odds are you're not going to end up with your true love in this life. Well, what happens if you're filing out of church one day, and as you get to the end of the aisle, pew and start to turn down, you look across and your eyes meet, and it's them with their husbands and their children. And you're there with your wife and your children. What do you do about it? You don't do anything about it. Because you're married. Romantics don't break vows just because they found their true love finally. You wait. Maybe their spouse dies and your spouse dies, and if that happens, then you get together. And if you don't, you get together in the afterlife. Just the fact that you knew that was your true love. The romantics don't really have to consummate their love affairs. Like the modern people tend to think everything ends in sex, but it doesn't for the romantics. For the romantics, everything ends in love, which I know it takes a while to, and some people argue there is no difference between the two, and they may be right. But the romantics felt there was an enormous difference between the two, and love lasts. You don't need any physical dimension to that. So they're very big on anticipation and putting things off anyway. Well, Whittier meets his true love. He can't marry her. They spend a day together. As far as we know, he never declared his love for her. Did he have to? Not if the romantics are right. They looked in one another's eyes. They knew. They also knew they couldn't get married, so they knew it was going to be one of those hopeless loves. Whittier goes away, and I think it's 30 years later. They're having a class reunion. Whittier's become famous by then. And they write and ask him if he'll come back for it. And he says, I'll come back on one condition, if she's going to be there. 30 years he hadn't thought about it. More than that, more than 20 years since he had last seen her. He gets a letter from her husband. Says, I'm going bankrupt. I know how much my wife means to you. I know you wouldn't want her to suffer. Whittier takes all the money he has, all the money he can borrow, sends it to him. Says, never let her know where it came from. I mean, now you get $200 from a guy for an abortion, you're lucky. Somebody who never slept with you 20 years later, sending you every penny he has, that doesn't happen anymore. That's a romantic. And when you contrast that with Byron, who didn't even get the name and sometimes didn't even get the species of his partners, it's a pretty sharp contrast. And it's basically, that kind of sums up the difference between the European romantics and the American romantics. Also, the European romantics are much more into the bleaker emotions. And they don't, as the Fireside poets do, aim most of their stuff at children. All the romantics love the good cry. The European romantics liked not so much a good cry as a bleak and almost despairing inevitability of death. For example, probably the best example of this is in Thanatopsis by William Cullen Bryant. Now in this poem, he looks like a European romantic. You don't have all of the characteristics that you have in the Fireside poem. It's First of all, if you notice, it's all one long stanza. The lines aren't short. They're pretty long. You don't have an insistent sing-song kind of rhythm. You don't have the obvious repetitive kind of rhyme in the poem. You don't have most of what you'd expect, in fact, from a romantic poem. One of the things that the romantics see in nature is the idea of rebirth. To the romantics, we don't die. Death is not the end of everything. There's a world beyond this, and a world largely where good and evil are rewarded. And so what seems to die really doesn't. And so they look to nature because nature seems to die during the winter, but it comes back to life again in the spring. And they saw that as a symbol of resurrection and the fact that things don't die. Now, Thanatopsis is a poem about death. And at first, it almost looks like a romantic poem because it talks about people who can go out and commune with nature. The hymn in the love of nature holds communion with her visible forms. She speaks a various language. For his gayer hours she has a voice of gladness and a smile and eloquence of beauty. And she glides into his darker musings with a mild and gentle sympathy that steals their sharpness ere he is aware. So if you feel good, go out into nature, you feel even better. You feel bad, nature will cheer you up. Well, that's what we'd expect a romantic to say. When thoughts of the last bitter hour come like a blight over thy spirit, and sad images of the stern agony. What's stern agony? The death throes. Death didn't come easy. You don't get people died at home then. They didn't have a lot of drugs and things that we have. Anesthesia doesn't even get invented in the 1840s. So people suffered a lot. So he's talking about the struggle when you're dying. And shroud. Shroud was a winding sheet that they wrapped the corpses in. And pall. Pall was the crepe that they hung on the coffin. And the breathless dark. And the narrow house. What's the narrow house? The coffin. Make thee to shudder and grow sick at heart. So whenever you start thinking about being dead and vanishing forever and non-existence, and your stomach drops out of you, go forth under the open sky and listen to nature's teaching, where from all around earth and her waters and the depths of air comes a still voice. Up to that point, it's exactly what you expect from a romantic. When you think about being dead, go out into nature, and nature will say to you, and we expect it to say, cheer up, you don't die. But look what it does say. Yet a few days, and thee, the all-beholding sun, shall see no more in all his course, nor yet in the pale ground where thy pale form was laid, with many tears. Nor in embrace of ocean shall exist thine image. Earth that nourished thee shall claim thy growth to be resolved to earth again. Cheer up, in a few days there'll be nothing left of you at all, no trace. That's not the uplifting idea that we expected to get out of nature. Earth that nourished thee shall claim thy growth to be resolved to earth again. Now normally you go back to nature and you're still part of nature then. You get to experience the world as part of nature. But this doesn't give you that hopeful feeling. In other words, you'll get to be you get to be a tree and face the thunder and the blast and know what it's like to face the storm, just like you did in life. But Bryant tells us, the earth shall claim thy growth to be resolved to earth again, and lost each human trace, surrendering up thine individual being shalt thou go, to mix forever with the elements, to be a brother to the insensible rock, and the sluggish clod which the rude swain turns with his share and treads upon. Cheer up, you're going to come back as a rock. I don't mind coming back as a rock, as long as I know I'm a rock. But this says you won't even know it. You're going to forever, your elements are going to mix with the elements of nature. And you'll be a sluggish clod, you'll be a lump of dirt that some hick farm boy will turn over with his plow and step on and never know it was you. And you won't even know it was you. Is this uplifting? Is this the poem you would send somebody contemplating suicide to try to cheer them up? It's not at all what we expect. Then the oak shall send his roots abroad and pierce thy mold. And there should be a line that says, and then you'll become one with the mighty oak. But there isn't. So what's it saying about you after death? Your fertilizer, your plant food. There's nothing to look forward to. The only thing that's supposed to cheer you up is you're not going to die alone. Yet not to thy eternal resting place shall thou retire alone, nor couldst thou wish a couch more magnificent. You're going to be dead and not know it, but you'll have a nice place to lie down. Thou shalt lie down with patriarchs of the infant world, with kings, the powerful of the earth, the wise, the good, fair forms, and hoary seers of ages past. So cheer up, you're going to die and be with the beautiful people and the rich and the famous. I'd rather be alive with bums, frankly, than dead with anybody. All in one sepulcher. Then he starts to give us the kind of picture, again, that we'd expect from a romantic, of collapsing chair. I didn't just shrink. I'm getting old. I'm shrinking, but not that fast. We get this picture of nature, which is normally supposed to cheer us up. The hills, rock-ribbed and ancient as the sun. The vales, the valleys, stretching in pensive, thoughtful quietness between. The venerable woods, rivers that move in majesty, and the complaining brook that make the meadows green. So there's this beautiful picture of life. And then immediately undercuts it. And poured round all old oceans gray and melancholy waste. But the solemn decorations all of the great tomb of man. All earth really is a cemetery. That was surprising. Get the nice picture of nature, and then he undercuts it and says, it's not what you think it's going to be. Then he tells you to cheer up because the dead are everywhere. They're even in Oregon. And what if thou fall unnoticed by the living, and no friend take note of thy departure? That's the saddest thing they could think of, that you died and nobody knew or cared. But what's supposed to cheer you up is, all that breathe will share thy destiny. The gay will laugh when thou art gone, the solemn brood of care plod on, and each one as before will chase his favorite phantom. Yet all these shall leave their mirth and their employments, and shall come and make their bed with thee as the long train of ages glides away. The sons of men, the youth in life's green spring. He who goes in the full strength of years, matron and maid, the bowed with age, the infant in the smiles and beauty of its innocence cut off, shall one by one be gathered to thy side by those who in their turn shall follow them. Life is one long funeral procession with everybody burying the people ahead of them and waiting to get buried by the people behind. Again, not very cheerful. What are, as you'll see later, are called romantic touchstones, images that are supposed to conjure up positive feelings in you, like the baby. The romantic touchstone is an idea or an object that conjures up an emotional response. And the baby was one of the most common. If I brought a baby in here, even a rationalist would be giving them her little finger and talking baby talk to them. So we all respond to babies. But no matter how romantic you are, the 100th baby that comes in, you'd have to be psychotic to be going, oh, another baby, wonderful. Most of it going, where are all these babies coming from? So the rationalists argued that it got worn out quickly. When you say innocent babe once, it conjures up an image and people respond emotionally. But when every poem you see has the words innocent babe in it somewhere, you stop responding to it. The same thing with youth. The older you get, the more magical youth becomes. Being a teenager for most people is a nightmare. I mean, no matter how well you do, no matter how popular you were, you still had those terrible things that at the time seemed incredibly and even devastatingly significant. I mean, you get a zit now, you go, well, that happens. But when you were 17, that was the end of your life. You were going to have to wear a paper bag over your head until you were 40, and nobody cared what you looked like anymore. People forget how traumatic it was. We tend to remember the good things. So when they mention youth, if you're young, you tend to think well of it, and if you're old, you think even better of it, because you only remember the good parts. And it's bittersweet, and they love that, to make you happy and sad at the same time. Because if you're old, you only remember the good parts of youth and you realize that it's gone. So there were thousands of poems entitled Youth, or that mentioned youth. And it was supposed to be an uplifting thing. But look how the baby comes off in this. In this, babies die. In the smiles of their innocence and beauty cut off. The noble savage wiped out. And the youth dies too. And so do people who are virtuous, and so do people who are wise, and it doesn't matter. Everybody dies. And he doesn't give us anything really to look forward to. All he does is tell you to try to die bravely. Thou go not like the quarry slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but sustained and soothed by an unfaltering trust. But he never tells us what it is we're supposed to trust in. There's been nothing mentioned in the poem that you could trust in. Approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. So die bravely like you were just going to sleep. Although he seems to say it's an endless sleep and you won't ever wake up from it and there'll be nothing left of you. That's not... Now the Europeans looked at that and said, boy, that's tough. This guy looks death in the face and he writes about it and he doesn't pull any punches. And it's a frightening and a depressing poem. What a great thing. Americans who believe, the Fireside poets who believe that the primary purpose of poetry is to teach and inspire, said, well, what did that teach? There's no point being good because death is death. It's the end of everything. And it's not very inspiring to believe that in the end you turn around to be nothing but dirt that doesn't even know it was ever anything else. So they would have, the Firesides would have said this was a terrible poem. Now, if you look at To a Waterfowl, you see another poem by the same poet, by Bryant, dealing with the same subject, death, but written entirely differently. How about the form of that poem? How is it different from Thanatopsis? For you got a bunch of little four-line stanzas. The lines aren't, most of the lines aren't as long. You've got a rhythm in the poem that sort of dances along. And you've got the rhyming every other line. Do and pursue, day and way, eye and sky, wrong and along. Most of them are real rhymes. Whither midst falling dew, while glow the heavens with the last steps of day, far through their rosy depths dost thou pursue thy solitary way? So he asked the waterfowl, where are you going? And you notice what time of day it is. Sunset. Not a bad image of going into the night, going into death, but it's not a scary one. You have a sunset, there's a night that's followed by a sunrise. Things come back again. And the sky isn't a frightening place, it's got a rosy depth, and you have a lot of descriptive adjectives used in the poem to stir up your senses and with them your emotions. Vainly the fowler's eye might mark thy distant flight to do thee wrong, as darkly painted on the crimson sky thy figure floats along. Well, if the bird is the soul, or man, who or what is the fowler? Death. You notice in this poem, death can only see the bird, it can't get at it. It would like to do it wrong, but it can't. And it can't because the bird, the soul, doesn't die. Vainly the fowler looks. The fowler's a guy who catches birds, but he looks at this one in vain. It soars on past him across the sunset. Then he wants to know, is the bird looking for some sort of heaven? The weedy lake, the marge of the river, the ocean side. What is the bird looking for? There is a power whose care teaches thy way along that pathless coast, the desert and illimitable air, lone wandering, but not lost. Why is power capitalized? It's God. There's a divinity guiding the flight of the bird. There are no maps. There are no road signs for the bird, and yet it gets where it's supposed to go. And this poem says because there's a benevolent deity guiding it there. There's a struggle, as you'll see when we look at the characteristics. Life is supposed to be a struggle for the romantic. Struggle builds character. All day thy wings have fanned at that far height the cold, thin atmosphere. Yet stoop not, weary, to the welcome land, though dark night is near. You can't give up. Life is a struggle, and it's meant to be. You get old, and things get harder, but you can't stop flying. And the bird doesn't. The bird continues on with its struggle, and man is supposed to continue on with his. And soon that toil shall end. But you notice it's not the end from Thanatopsis. The bird doesn't die and get eaten by something else, or the worms get it, or it turns into dirt. Soon thou shalt find a summer home, and rest, and scream among thy fellows. Reeds shall bend soon o'er thy sheltered nest. The bird ends up in a heaven, in a paradise. Okay, it's bird heaven, but it's still a heaven. Then we get the announcement that a moral is coming. Thou art gone, the abyss of heaven hath swallowed up thy form. Now normally you would think of the abyss as the endless drop, the nothingness. But here it's the abyss of heaven. And of course heaven has the connotations of paradise and so on. Yet on my heart deeply has sunk the lesson thou hast given. They wanted to teach and inspire, and so it's teaching us a lesson, and here it comes. And shall not soon depart. And here's the lesson. He who from zone to zone guides to the boundless sky thy certain flight, in the long way I must tread alone, will lead my steps aright. So whatever divinity it is that makes birds get to where they're supposed to be must certainly guide the steps of human beings. So you notice in this one, death isn't the end of everything. Death can't touch you. The soul is immortal. Everything, nature gives us that lesson we expect from romantics, which is that there is no death, that things go on. And you notice again, it's easy to understand. The meaning of the poem is specifically stated. It's simply constructed. It's a poem that you could read to children, and even children would understand. That is a Fireside poem. Same poet, one's a European poem, one's an American poem. Now, if we look over at the principles of the Fireside poets, the first one I'd already mentioned, and that is the primary purpose of poetry is to teach or inspire. The Europeans leaned much more to the idea that the function of poetry is self-expression, that it's for the poet to get his emotions out. And how they affect other people, that's just the way the chips fall. It ought to have an explicit meaning or moral of the poem, since the primary objective of the poem is to be understood. If you're going to teach, and when they talked about teaching, they didn't mean specific facts. They were mainly looking at moral values. Well, when is the best time to inculcate moral values? When people are old? No, younger the better. And so, if you want to change people's morality, if you want to give them a belief in morality, you want to start when they're young. So although the poems were meant to be read by adults, they were also meant to be read and recited by children. I mean, they're called the Fireside Poets because the idea was that after dinner, the family would gather around the fireside and read the poems. And as often as not, it was the children who memorized and recited the poems. If you went to visit a married friend and they had kids, it was a dead certainty that they would trot them out to recite poems for you. And so if that's the case, you want them, the poems to be easy to learn, and you want the basic principle in the poem to be easy to understand. And the reason you have this explicit statement of the meaning, the moral at the end, is because if you tell a story that illustrates a moral principle, an adult will realize that this is a metaphor for the truth that you're trying to tell. A child will get wrapped up in the story and not always draw the moral conclusion. But that's what you have the poem for, to get them to that moral end, so you want to put it out as plainly as possible for them. Now, the modern critics hate the Romantics. Rutgers is mostly a neoclassical place, so they don't even like the metaphysicals. And they downright despise the Fireside poets. The reason modern critics do, because we're largely an intellectual age. And so we, at least the critics generally despise emotion. Because anybody can have emotions. but only really important people like critics can have thoughts. That's what sets them apart. Most of the professors at Rutgers don't like the Fireside Poets. They're too simple. The fact that there's a moral at the end, they take as a personal affront. What, Longfellow thought I was so dumb I couldn't figure this out? He had to spell it out for me? What a crummy poem. Commonality of experience and education of the audience should be included in the poem, since most people remember things by associating with what they already know, and the practical application of the moral truth is the ultimate end of the poem. In other words, you put as much of ordinary life in there so that children in particular can see the connection between the two. Again, the modern critic attacks that. Now, the idea was you want to aim for the experiences that most people have. When he writes about Longfellow writes about the village blacksmith, everybody had seen a blacksmith. The modern critic says that the Fireside Poets basically wrote for a white middle-class Christian, if not mostly Protestant, audience. And that wasn't what America was. And America had all kinds of variations to it and all kinds of subculture. And it did, but not anywhere near as many as there are now, and not anywhere near as prominent. If you were aiming for a commonality of experience, that's who you would have aimed for. That was what the majority of people were like. And you notice it doesn't try to convince you to be any one of those things. In other words, it's now, the Fireside Poets are now attacked because they're not multicultural enough. Well, it wasn't a multicultural time. It wasn't a multicultural culture. It was largely a WASP-dominated culture. And so if you're going for the commonality experience, that's what you go for. Also, they had a commonality of experience not only because most people lived in small towns, but because they read the same books. McGuffey's Reader 1 through 9 was used pretty much everywhere. So what that meant was that people read the same stories, and they read the same essays, and they had the same literary experience. That's hardly the case anymore. If I ever had grandchildren, about the only common literary experience we would probably have would be Gilligan's Island. They'd have seen it in reruns, and I'd have seen it in the original. But other than that, there isn't going to be a bunch of things that they'll have read that I'll have, except maybe Dr. Seuss. Maybe culture isn't as bad off as I thought it was. In any case, the modern critic looks at this and says it's too narrow a view of America. America was much more pluralistic than that. Fireside Poets said, no, this is what the majority of people are, and we're not trying to aggrandize the dominant culture. What we're trying to do is to get at a commonality of experience, something that most people will be able to plug into. Emotional touchstones I'd mentioned before. They're those objects that are supposed to conjure up an emotion. And of course, the modern critic despises them as well. And sometimes for good reason, because they get worn out. When you use if somebody came up with a successful emotional touchstone, every romantic poet who read it then appropriated it for their work. Well, the first time you see it, it works. But the 100th time you see it, it doesn't. And so you often have cliches developing in the poems. And a lot of them hit over and over. So the modern critic's argument is that the poetry is too cliche. An explicit analogy between an object or phenomenon in nature and human experience, because that's the most easily understood. In other words, some phenomenon that people had seen that was universal, because nature is everywhere, that most people had come in contact with. That was one you want to use for metaphors, because people can plug into that most easily. The modern critic says these are too simple, and they're too superficial. Now, that example there of Longfellow's comparison of a cross of snow. Longfellow is the greatest of the Fireside Poets. He was the most popular. He wrote a number of the equivalent of bestsellers. Epic poems. Longfellow was a brilliant guy. The modern critic acts as if Longfellow could not have written more difficult poems if he wanted to. That he wrote these little poems with a heavy beat and an obvious rhyme because that was all the better he could do. That's far from the truth. First of all, Longfellow was one of the first professors, college professors of modern languages. He wrote all the original textbooks for modern languages. He spoke 7 languages fluently. As a poet, if you take one of his epic poems, and again, to write an epic poem, thousands of lines long, keeping up the rhyme scheme and the meter all the way through, telling a story, developing characters, and doing everything that a novelist would do as well, and doing it in verse, you got to be a really good poet to do that. And he not only did it, but he did successful ones. He did ones that people went out and bought. Lots of people went out and bought. In one of his most famous, Song Hiawatha, by the shores of Gitche Gumee, by the shining deep sea waters of the, it's not the warriors, it's something of the old Nokomis. Anyway, it's got that rhythm. That rhythm is the rhythm of the Icelandic sagas, in their original Old Norse. Now, he had read and studied those. So in other words, this is a guy who can read an ancient language, take the rhythms of that language, and translate the rhythms over into English. You got to be a good poet to do that. If Longfellow had wanted to write Edward Taylor's poems, he could have done it. If he had wanted to write difficult poems, if he had wanted to write neoclassical poems, he could certainly have done it. He had the background for it. But he didn't. That wasn't his vision of poetry. So when the modern critic attacks Longfellow as being too simple, they're really not giving him credit for the talent that he really had. It's much harder to take a truth and put it into words that everybody can understand, even children, than it is to express that truth in a language that only a few people can understand. So Longfellow had a talent that probably most of the more famous poets didn't have. It's his simplicity that really shows you how talented he is. Now, he met his true love. It was his second wife. I'm sure he loved his first wife, but his second wife was his true love. And they had a blissful marriage, never a harsh word between them as far as anybody knows. They had 2 daughters. He was a college professor, but she was wealthy, so he had gotten some money when he married her, and I think he got some money from his first wife. Well, I might have that mixed up with Emerson. In any case, they have this wonderful, happy home life, just what it's supposed to be like. And one day, his wife is curling their daughter's hair, making those kind of baloney curls, and they had a little thing that they would put in the fire, like a piece of metal, or kind of a rod, and they would wrap the hair around it and draw it down through, and that would make the ringlets. And when she goes to do that, an ember pops out of the fire and sets her muslin dress on fire, and she burned to death. Longfellow threw himself on top of her and tried to smother the flames, and was so badly burned himself that he was bedridden for 3 months. Now this poem, Across of Snow, which the modern critic sees as too sentimental and too simple, is about waking up 18 years after her death, in the middle of the night, and thinking about it. In the long sleepless watches of the night, a gentle face, the face of one long dead, looks at me from the wall where round its head the night lamp casts a halo of pale light. And the modern critic says, oh, give us a break. There's a halo around their picture. In fact, it's a good description of exactly what he would have seen when he woke up. They tended to put the pictures, you've probably seen old-fashioned pictures, they're mostly in oval frames. If it was on a wall and they would have had the little like hurricane lamp with oil, whale oil in it, it gives off a pinkish glow. And back against the wall, it would have made a halo of pale light. In fact, I think one of the reasons why the 20th century develops realism and naturalism and existentialism, the harsh philosophies that the real world is the only world and death is the end of everything, is the lighting. Why are candlelight dinners considered romantic? Because everybody looks good in that light. Even I look good in that light. It's a yellowish, reddish light. It gives your cheeks a glow. It makes everybody, and it's also kind of dim. So it hides all the blemishes, and it brings out that rosy kind of glow to everything. So it makes everybody look good. It hides all the ugly details of reality. But the light of the 20th century is this light. This is operating room light. This light doesn't give you any break. I don't care what QVC says, there is no makeup for this kind of light. Because this kind of light exposes everything. And that, of course, leads to realism. It's hard to keep a romantic ideal of things when you have this harsh light of the present shining on it. In any case, there's this halo around his wife's picture, which the modern critic says is making her too good. Here in this room she died, and soul more white, never through martyrdom of fire was led to its repose. Remember, his wife burned to death. Nor can in books be read the legend of a life, that's a misprint there, shouldn't be a file, a life more benedict. And the modern critic says, oh, give us a break, she was a saint, she's got a halo around her. There is a mountain in the distant west that, sun-defying in its deep ravines, displays a cross of snow upon its side. Such is the cross I wear upon my breast, these 18 years, through all the changing scenes and seasons, changeless, since the day she died. Now the modern critic says, this is a bad kind of comparison because it's so simple. Anybody know what the phrase was if you had difficulties in your life in those days? You had a cross to bear, a reference to Christ having to carry his own cross to the crucifixion. So to them, it's too simple to take a common cliche, a cross to bear, and turn it into, compare it with something in nature. I thought that he had made up this unmelting cross, but it turns out there not only was one, but that everybody would have known what it was he was talking about. There was a postcard of a glacier in Alaska, which if you were predisposed to seeing it, looked like a cross. And it's a glacier, so it doesn't melt. And this was a very popular postcard, and so everybody knew exactly what the unmelting cross of snow was that he's talking about. But the modern critic says, well, this is too superficial. But if you look closer at the poem, you find out that's really not just what he's talking about. First, the first question is, why does he wake up in the middle of the night? Now, when you wake up in the middle of the night, past a certain age, your death will be sitting on the end of the bed. Mortality in the middle of the night, when it's quiet and dark, makes you think about being dead. Now, we don't have to keep thinking about being dead. QVC is on all night long. CNN is on all night. If you're desperate for human contact, there are 900 numbers that you can pay $4 a minute to talk to. You can call into telephone, to radio shows. We don't have to sit there and deal with that. But in the 19th century, you wake up in the middle of the night, it's quiet in a way it never gets quiet anymore. And it's dark in a way it never gets quiet anymore, gets dark anymore. You have to go out west to see what darkness is like. It's stars. There's so much light pollution between Washington and Boston that the observatories don't even work here anymore. So you wake up and you tend to be thinking about death anyway. But the question is, what woke him up? The cross of snow that's on his chest, which the modern critic sees as metaphoric, isn't a metaphor at all. Remember what happened when his wife burned to death? He tried to put her out. He grabbed her and rolled on top of her. His chest was all burned. What wakes him up at night is the scar tissue tightening up, especially when it's cold. Doesn't get much circulation. You go to sleep and that pain wakes him up. And of course, the pain that's in his chest is really only symbolic of the pain of having lost his wife. You might think, well, 18 years, get over it. Get on with your life. That isn't the way it works. Anybody who loves death is always 5 minutes ago. And so when he wakes up, when he first wakes up, that pain is there, and the pain immediately makes him think of that loss. So it's not this superficial poem at all. It's really got an underlying meaning to it. And that comparison between the scar tissue, what would it look like? Yeah, it would be ugly. Yes, it would. Generally, it would be whiter than his skin, and cold because it hasn't got much circulation. So it's like the cross of snow. So that comparison is really a pretty good one. And the modern critic just laughs it off and says, "Oh, it's too sentimental, too much emotion." Of course, for the modern critic, who's generally neoclassicist, all emotion is bad, and most emotion is phony. So they tend to think this is a terrible poem. I tend to think it's a lot better poem than people give it any credit for. When you look at their favorite themes, they're pretty much what you'd expect from a fireside poet: home and family. Little children are going to recite the poems to the rest of the family. So if they're about home and family, everybody's happy. Children, why would children be a particularly popular subject for the Romantics? The noble savage? Tell me I did Romanticism. I did. Okay. Noble savage, the child was the best example of natural man. So they're going to bring them into the poem all the time. Nature with a big N, meaning not just trees and flowers, but the physical world, the natural world that man hasn't changed, and which represents rebirth and resurrection. Idealized love. Nostalgia. What's nostalgia? A longing for the past, generally an idealized past. Legend, especially things with ghosts and stuff in it, because ghosts tell you there's an afterlife. Death isn't the end of everything. History, but not the way we think of history. History in its romantic sense. They really believed that Washington never told a lie. They really believed Paul Revere made the whole ride. Love of country. Hard to imagine now. Not partisan politics. Doesn't try to make you a Whig or doesn't try to make you a Democrat or a Republican. It talks about a love of the ideal America. Now, so many truly scummy figures have wrapped themselves up in the flag that it's no longer a symbol for a lot of Americans of anything to look up to and admire, because it's associated with the politicians who abused it. But in the 19th century, when the flag was raised, everybody got a lump in their throat. They got a tear in their eye. When they sang "God Bless America," their voices cracked. They believed in this ideal. Yeah, it was true. And when it got to the end of the land of the free, in which more than half the people couldn't vote, it was hardly the land of the free. But if you told anybody that, they would have punched you out for it, because they love to believe in that ideal of America, which has largely been lost. Religion, but not Taylor's religion, not trying to convert you to anything, simply mentioning religion because it was a basic fact of life. And usually it was non-denominational Protestant, because that was the large majority. And finally, the necessary balance of good and bad in human experience. When you look at the village blacksmith, where does it take place? Under a spreading chestnut tree. In reality, the blacksmith did most of his work inside his little shed. We bring him out in the middle of nature. He's strong and he's strong. He's the strong, silent, dependable guy that 19th century men were supposed to be. He works hard, he's honest, and he's living with his grief. What's his grief? His wife died. We get his children, how proud he is of his children. He listens to his daughter singing in the choir. He sits with his son. That makes him think of his lost wife. Why are there so many romantic poems about dead mothers? Childbirth killed so many of them. It was something that children were going to have to deal with. And the fact that they dealt with them in this romantic way helped everybody deal with a tragedy that was likely to happen to them. And in fact, may have happened to them already. The Romantics didn't see anything wrong with crying over a poem. And if you told Longfellow that when people read this poem they cried, he would have said that's exactly what they should have done. Of course, at the end, he tells you that's the way life ought to be. It should be a struggle. And again, you get that announcement. Thanks to thee, my worthy friend, for the lesson thou hast taught. Notice again, a lesson, a moral is being taught. Thus at the flaming forge of life our fortunes must be wrought, shaped. Thus from the sounding anvil shaped each burning deed and thought. You're put in the fire in order to toughen you. Life should be both hard and easy. It should be a mixture of good and bad. It should be a struggle. It's a struggle that builds your character. How would you know the Children's Hour was written by a fireside poet? It's all about children. It's about quality time. The kids sneak down. Well, when they're upstairs, I hear in the chamber above me the patter of little feet. The patter of little feet entered the language. If you were pregnant for a long time, they said, oh, you're going to hear the patter of little feet. It was so popular, a touchstone, it became part of the language. The sound of a door that is open and voices soft and sweet. Is that what the kids sound like upstairs? No, generally you're wondering, how did they get a rhinoceros up there, and what are they doing to it to make it run back and forth? You hear voices soft and sweet, you're upstairs like a shot. They're either setting the bed on fire, playing with matches, or they're doing something else, because they're never quiet otherwise. Well, why do you get this picture of the idealized child? Well, first of all, children were a lot better behaved in the 19th century because they got beaten more if they weren't. Secondly, these are girls. Girls were soft and sweet when their voices, or society came down on them like a ton of bricks. And at the end, he's got them fast in his